After World War II, Italy didn't just face the task of rebuilding what had been destroyed. It faced the pressure to move quickly, to restore industry, to keep cities alive, and to supply electricity at a scale the country had never needed before. Factories had to run, urban centers had to expand, and energy became a national priority. In that atmosphere, mountains were no longer viewed simply as geography. They were increasingly seen as resources, structures that could be shaped, measured, and put to work. Narrow valleys, sheer rock walls, and rivers forced through steep terrain appeared to offer something valuable: high efficiency, reduced material use, and enormous energy potential. Vajont was one of those locations. A deep, narrow gorge compressed between massive rock faces, where engineers believed a thin arch dam could rise higher than almost anywhere else at the time. They didn't just build a dam there. They cut deeply into the mountain itself. The structure was designed to rely on the surrounding rock for its strength, using pressure rather than mass. Less concrete, more force, and greater efficiency on paper. And on paper, everything made sense. But this project was never only about stopping a river. For the dam to exist, the valley had to be reshaped. And for the reservoir to function, millions of cubic meters of water would be held in place directly beneath steep, towering slopes. At the center of the design was a simple assumption: if the dam was strong enough, the mountain would remain still. Geological surveys were carried out, reports were compiled, and risks were identified. But those risks were classified as manageable, not as reasons to stop. The mountain had moved before, slowly, over long periods of time, and nothing in the available data suggested an immediate danger. At least that was how it was understood. At that moment, no one believed they were crossing a boundary. They believed the system was under control. And once that belief became the foundation of the project, Vajont was no longer just a hydroelectric dam in the conventional sense. It had become a test between human engineering and a mountain that had never been required to remain still. Once the decision was made, the project moved quickly, from concept to transformation. What followed was not a single act of construction, but a sequence of interventions that steadily pushed deeper into the mountain itself. The dam was designed as a thin, double-curved arch, an elegant structure meant to draw its strength from the surrounding rock, transferring immense pressure outward rather than resisting it through mass alone. It was a design that demanded precision. To support it, the valley was reshaped and the mountain was opened. Tunnels were carved deep into the rock. Some diverted the river. Others filled the reservoir. Others drained it. Together, they formed a system that allowed engineers to raise and lower the water level with remarkable accuracy. This was not just infrastructure. It was a mechanism of control. Because from this point forward, water would no longer behave as a passive element. It would become the primary force acting on the mountain. As the reservoir began to take shape, millions of cubic meters of water were prepared to rest directly beneath steep slopes, held in place by concrete, rock, and calculation. Every meter the water rose changed the balance of forces inside the mountain. Pressure increased. Weight shifted. Internal stresses were redistributed. These effects were understood in theory. They had been modeled, calculated, and accepted as part of the design. The assumption remained intact, that if the structure was built correctly and the system was managed carefully, the mountain could be interacted with without losing control. By the time the reservoir entered its first filling phase, the project had crossed a quiet threshold. The mountain was no longer a backdrop to the dam. It had become part of the system. From that moment on, the project was no longer about building a structure and observing its surroundings. It was about actively engaging with a massive geological body, using water tunnels and engineering judgment to shape how it responded. That belief that the mountain could be managed through intervention was now embedded into the operation itself. And once embedded, It would define every step that followed. As the project continued, the data began to tell a story that no longer aligned cleanly with the confidence behind the design. The movement of the mountain did not stop. It slowed at times. It accelerated at others. And while each adjustment of the reservoir still appeared to influence the rate of movement, the relationship was becoming less stable, less predictable, and more difficult to explain with certainty. By this stage, monitoring had intensified. Survey markers were installed across the slope. Cracks were mapped and measured. Instruments recorded displacement day after day, sometimes changing by millimeters, sometimes by centimeters, without a clear external trigger. What had once looked like controlled behavior was beginning to look conditional. The southern slope of Monte Toc was not simply sliding along a single surface. It was deforming. Movement was spreading across a wide mass of rock, involving layers that extended far deeper than initially assumed. Beneath the limestone, a thin clay layer, only a few centimeters thick, had been identified. Under dry conditions, it remained relatively stable. But when water reached it, its shear strength dropped sharply. As the reservoir level changed, water continued to percolate through the permeable limestone, accumulating along that hidden boundary. This was not a sudden discovery. The mechanism was understood in principle. What was becoming difficult to reconcile was the scale. The volume of rock involved was far larger than early models had assumed, and the mountain was no longer responsive as a single uniform body. In November 1960, a significant landslide occurred, sending hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of material into the reservoir within minutes. It was not catastrophic. The dam remained intact. Downstream villages were unaffected. But the event changed the nature of the evidence. What had previously been gradual movement had now crossed a visible threshold. The slope could fail rapidly, not just slowly. In response, engineers did not abandon the project. They expanded their analysis. Physical scale models were built. Controlled experiments were conducted to simulate what might happen if a larger section of the mountain were to slide into a partially filled reservoir. The results were not reassuring. The models showed that if the slide occurred slowly, the reservoir could absorb the displacement. But if it accelerated, if the mass entered the water at high speed, the resulting wave would overtop the dam, even if the structure itself remained standing. The implication was clear. The danger did not lie in the dam failing. It lay in what the dam could not prevent. These findings were documented. They were discussed. They were known. But they existed alongside another set of observations. When the reservoir level was lowered, movement decreased. When it was raised, movement increased. To the engineers managing the site, this still looked like a controllable system. The data was not being ignored. It was being interpreted through a framework that assumed control remained possible. The warnings were real, but they were incremental. There was no single moment that demanded an immediate stop. Instead, there was a growing tension between what the measurements were showing and what the project required to continue. The mountain was no longer behaving exactly as expected, but it was still responding. And as long as it responded, the belief persisted that it could be guided. That belief would shape every decision that followed. And because it was still responding, they believed there was still time. Time to adjust. Time to lower the water level. Time to intervene one more time, if necessary. For months, every decision was made on that assumption, until time was no longer on their side. On the night of October 9th, 1963, the mountain stopped responding. There was no gradual adjustment, no slowing, no window left for correction. The southern face of Monte Toc collapsed all at once. Between 200 and 300 million cubic meters of rock detached from the mountainside and accelerated toward the reservoir. The movement was almost instantaneous. In less than a minute, the entire mass entered the water. The dam did not fail. The structure remained intact, exactly as it had been designed to do. But the reservoir could not absorb what had just been released into it. A vast volume of water was displaced upward and outward, forced out of the basin by the sheer speed and scale of the landslide. The wave rose higher than the crest of the dam, not because the dam was weak, but because nothing in its design was meant to stop what came next. Water spilled over the top, not as a gradual overflow, but as a single overwhelming surge. Within minutes, the valley below was gone. Entire towns were erased by a force that never touched the dam itself. In Longeron and the surrounding villages, thousands of people were killed in the time it takes to realize something is wrong. By morning, the structure still stood. From above, the dam appeared unchanged. But the reservoir behind it was no longer a reservoir. It had been filled, almost entirely, by the mountain. The project had not failed in the way engineers had imagined. The calculations were not wrong about the strength of the concrete. What failed was the assumption that the system would always respond before it crossed a limit. That night, the limit was crossed all at once. And once it was, there was nothing left to adjust. By the next morning, there was nothing left to decide. The reservoir was no longer a reservoir. It had been filled, almost entirely, by the collapsed mass of the mountain itself. The water level could not be adjusted. The tunnels no longer mattered. No operational change could restore what had been lost. Every assumption that had supported continued operation was gone. There was no scenario in which power generation could resume. No practical way to clear the basin. No engineering intervention capable of reversing a collapse of that scale. What remained was a structure with no function. The dam still stood. Its concrete face was intact, its crest unchanged. But the system it was meant to control no longer existed. In the days that followed, the site shifted from operation to assessment. Measurements were taken, reports were compiled. The physical limits of the valley were documented as they now were, not as they had been imagined. The numbers began to emerge. Official counts would later place the loss of life at just under 2,000 people across Longeron and the surrounding villages. Entire communities were gone. There was no question of rebuilding the project. Not because it was unsafe to continue, but because there was nothing left to continue with. The mountain had moved. The basin was gone. And with it, the purpose of the dam. Vajont had become a standing structure without a future. The engineering had not collapsed. The project had. In the aftermath, the question was no longer what had happened. That was already known. The question was how it would be understood and where responsibility would be placed. From the beginning, the disaster was not treated as a purely natural event. Formal investigations were opened. Technical reports were reviewed. Decisions made over many years were examined in sequence. Attention shifted away from the night of the collapse and toward the months that came before it. Geologists had documented instability within the mountain. Engineers had measured movement. Model studies had shown that a rapid landslide could displace water far beyond the dam's capacity. None of this information was hidden, but none of it had been treated as a reason to stop. In the court proceedings that followed, responsibility was not assigned to the terrain or to chance. It was assigned to people. Italian courts later concluded that the disaster was foreseeable and that warnings had been acknowledged without sufficient restraint. Several senior figures connected to the project were found criminally responsible for decisions that allowed operations to continue. The judgment did not claim that the engineering had been careless. The dam itself had performed exactly as designed. What failed was judgment, the assumption that a complex natural system could be managed right up to its limit without crossing them. In the years that followed, Vajont became a reference point, not only in dam engineering, but in geotechnical science, risk management, and professional ethics. It was studied not as an accident, but as a case. A reminder that data alone does not make decisions. People do. For the communities below the dam, the aftermath was quieter. Entire towns were never rebuilt as they had been. Survivors were relocated. Valleys were altered permanently. For many, there was no place to return to. Over time, the dam itself remained silent, intact, unmoving, not as a monument to success, but as a marker of what happens when control is assumed to be complete. Vajont did not fade into history. It stayed as a lesson without spectacle, and as a memory that never needed to be exaggerated. Even with decades of study, Vajont does not offer a complete answer. The mechanics of the landslide are now broadly understood. The geological layers can be mapped. The sequence of events can be reconstructed. But understanding how something happened is not the same as understanding where certainty ends. The mountain did not fail because one calculation was wrong. It failed at the intersection of many correct decisions, each made within an acceptable margin of risk. What remains difficult to define is the moment when interaction becomes interference, when monitoring becomes reassurance, when response is mistaken for control. Modern geotechnical science has advanced considerably since Vajont. Models are more precise. Data is more abundant. Warning systems are more sophisticated. And yet, the same fundamental limitation remains. Natural systems do not behave like engineered ones. They do not fail gradually on schedule. They do not respect operational thresholds. They respond until they don't. Vajont raises a question that extends beyond dams and beyond geology. How close can complex systems be pushed toward their limit before prediction loses meaning? And how often does confidence grow not from certainty, but from familiarity? In the end, what Vajont leaves behind is not a mystery to be solved, but a boundary to be acknowledged. A reminder that knowing more does not always mean controlling more, and that some limits do not announce themselves until they are crossed.